to form a team that would go and research the Shroud of Turin image?
When they put a photograph of the Shroud of Turin into the VP8, they got the natural relief of a human form.
The most studied object in human history is a 14-foot piece of linen that has survived fires, wars, and one of the most famous scientific tests ever conducted. That test said it was a medieval fake. The man who spent 46 years proving that test was Jewish, and he was wrong. He had no faith in Jesus. He had no reason to defend a Christian relic. He had only the evidence, and the evidence broke him. The conference that proved he mattered. In late July of 2025, over 425 people packed into a conference center near St. Louis, Missouri. They came from 10 different countries. They sat through 85 presentations across 5 days. Researchers, scientists, historians, and theologians, all flying in from across the world to spend nearly a week debating the same subject. And they did all of it to talk about a 14-foot piece of linen that has been sitting inside a climate-controlled case in Turin, Italy, for centuries. But before the first speaker even took the stage, the entire conference was dedicated to one man. A man who had died just 7 weeks before the event was announced. A man who, by every measure of background, belief, and biography, never should have been involved with this subject in the first place. His name was Barry Schwartz. He was Jewish, he was a commercial photographer from Santa Barbara, and he spent almost half his life becoming the most important scientific voice on the Shroud of Turin without ever converting to Christianity. Not once, not even at the end. The posthumous Lifetime Achievement Award they gave him at that conference was not a sympathy gesture. It was not the kind of polite honor you give someone because they showed up consistently. It was an acknowledgement that the entire modern scientific conversation about the Shroud of Turin runs through one man who started out trying to prove it was fake and spent 46 years unable to do so. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. Because the Shroud of Turin is not a story about faith looking for proof, it is not a story about believers trying to convert skeptics. It is a story about science following evidence into a place it did not expect to go. And one Jewish man from Pittsburgh who had no emotional stake in the outcome and no religious reason to care about the conclusion, finding himself unable to walk away from what he found. The cloth itself is a 14-foot linen burial sheet, bearing the faint straw-yellow image of a man who appears to have been tortured, crucified, and wrapped for burial. Millions of Christians believe it is the actual burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Scientists have been arguing about it for over 100 years, and in 1978, a team of 33 scientists from some of the most respected research institutions in the United States got unprecedented access to it for 5 continuous days and came away with results that, nearly 50 years later, still have not been fully explained. Barry Schwartz was their photographer. He walked in expecting to photograph brush strokes and paint pigments and go home. He walked out with 17 years of doubt ahead of him and 46 years of obsession following that. Let's get into exactly how it happened. The man who had no business being there. Barry Marshall Schwartz was born on the 12th of September 1946 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His parents had both emigrated from Poland as children just before the Second World War. His grandmother lived with the family. The household kept 2 sets of dishes and 2 sets of silverware in strict observance of Jewish dietary law. He had his bar mitzvah at 13 years old, and then he walked away from it all entirely. He told audiences for decades that at age 13, he left Judaism and never looked back. God was not part of his life. He went on to serve in the U.S. Navy, graduate from Brooks Institute of Photography in Santa Barbara, and build an award-winning commercial photography studio. He photographed food, products, and advertising campaigns. He was good at his job. He had no interest in religion of any kind. Then, in late 1976, a man named Don Devon from Oceanographic Services contacted him about joining a scientific team that was going to Italy to examine the Shroud of Turin. Schwartz said no immediately. He tried to quit the team twice before they even left for Turin. The person who kept him on the team was a NASA imaging scientist named Don Lin, who had worked on the Voyager, Viking, and Mariner missions. In a conversation that Schwartz repeated to audiences for the rest of his life, he asked Lynn directly why a Jewish man should want anything to do with the most important relic in Christianity. Lynn's response stopped him cold. He looked at Schwartz and said, "Have you forgotten that the man in question was a Jew?" Then he added something that Schwartz called the truest and most profound thing anyone ever said to him. "Barry, go to Turin, do the best job you can do. God does not tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you will know." Schwartz went to Turin. He expected to spend 5 days photographing brushstrokes and paint pigments. Within the first hour, he knew he was not looking at a painting. But the thing that kept him skeptical for 17 more years was something far simpler than paint. It was color. The blood on that cloth was red. Old blood does not stay red. And that single fact haunted him from 1978 all the way to 1995. 120 hours that changed everything. The Shroud of Turin research project, known as STURP, brought 33 scientists to Turin in October of 1978. They came from Los Alamos National Laboratory, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Air Force Academy. They were biologists, chemists, physicists, radiographers, and imaging specialists. Among them were atheists, agnostics, Mormons, Catholics, Protestants, and 3 Jewish scientists. Nobody on this team had any interest in manufacturing a miracle. They worked in the royal palace adjoining Turin Cathedral for 120 continuous hours. They ran X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectrometry, ultraviolet photography, thermography, and microchemical analysis. They used over 2 tons of equipment that had taken 19 months to design and build specifically for this examination. They collected 32 sticky tape surface samples using custom-designed applicators and $3,000 per roll adhesive tape from Los Alamos. By the time they were done, they had gathered enough data for 20 peer-reviewed papers and an estimated 250,000 combined hours of follow-up analysis. Their 1981 formal conclusion, written by STURP chemist John Heller and distributed at a meeting at Connecticut College, said the following: "No pigments, paints, dyes, or stains had been found on the cloth fibers. X-ray fluorescence and microchemistry ruled out paint entirely. The image was that of a real human form, a scourged and crucified man, and it was not the product of an artist." Then it said something extraordinary. The answer to the question of how the image was produced remains, now as it has in the past, a mystery. Heller later wrote about the experience with honesty that rarely appears in scientific literature. He said the team had been supremely confident that the answers would come, and they had failed. What they did confirm, beyond any scientific doubt, was that the blood on the cloth was real human blood. John Heller and Alan Adler, the team's blood chemists, ran 12 separate diagnostic tests confirming hemoglobin, porphyrin rings, and serum albumin. They found serum halos around the bloodstains, which are the pale fluorescent rings left when blood separates as it dries. No medieval painter would have thought to include these, because the phenomenon was not understood until modern forensic science identified it. But the color still made no sense to Schwartz, and it would not make sense for another 17 years. The blood that refused to age. Dr. Alan Adler was a chemistry professor at Western Connecticut State University and one of the world's leading experts on porphyrins, which are the molecular structures at the core of hemoglobin. He was also Jewish. He wore a giant diagram of a porphyrin molecule printed on his undershirt, like other men wear band logos. He was, by every account, relentlessly enthusiastic, almost impossible to interrupt, and the kind of scientist who treated every unanswered question as a personal challenge he intended to win. He never traveled to Turin. He never stood over the cloth the way Schwartz had in 1978. He worked entirely from the sticky tape samples collected during the STURP examination, analyzing them in his own laboratory at Western Connecticut. But what he found inside those samples over the following years solved a problem that had quietly haunted Barry Schwartz for nearly 2 decades and kept him from reaching a conclusion that every other piece of evidence was already pointing toward. The problem was the color of the blood. When the human body goes through extreme physical trauma, prolonged torture, or catastrophic physical injury,
What happens when this bilirubin begins to accumulate too high in the blood, resulting in a yellow discoloration? To begin with, we need to focus on bilirubin and what it actually is.
the liver responds in a very specific way. It floods the bloodstream with bilirubin. Bilirubin is a yellow-orange compound that the liver produces naturally when it breaks down red blood cells. Under normal circumstances, it circulates in small, manageable amounts. But under conditions of extreme and sustained violence against the body, it appears in quantities so overwhelming that it fundamentally and permanently alters the chemistry of the blood itself. Here is precisely what that alteration does. Bilirubin binds to hemoglobin and converts it into what chemists call a parahemic form. When the yellow-orange of that enhanced bilirubin combines with the orange-brown of methemoglobin in its parahemic state, the resulting dried blood film does not behave the way any forensic scientist would expect old blood to behave. It does not turn brown. It does not turn black. It does not fade or oxidize in the normal way. It stays red, permanently, indefinitely, across centuries if necessary. The blood on the shroud was not red because it was paint. It was not red because a medieval forger had chosen the wrong pigment or made some careless artistic decision. It was red because the man whose blood it was had been subjected to a level of sustained physical torture so extreme that his own liver chemistry had recorded the violence permanently, encoding it into the color of his blood in a way that 2,000 years could not undo. And then there is the detail that makes this finding almost impossible to argue against. Adler and his STURP colleague, John Heller, confirmed through careful microscopic analysis that there was not a single image-colored fiber anywhere beneath any of the bloodstains on the entire cloth. Not one. The blood was on the cloth before the image formed. If anyone had created the shroud as a deliberate forgery, they would have done what every artist in recorded human history has done. They would have created the figure first and then added blood on top. The shroud does the exact opposite. Blood first, then image. That sequence alone rules out painting, rubbing, printing, and every contact transfer method that has ever been proposed by anyone attempting to explain the cloth as a human creation.
On findings being published in a new book out today on the Shroud of Turin. That's the linen cloth believed to bear Jesus' imprint as he was being prepared for burial.
In the mid-1990s, during one of the regular phone calls he maintained with Schwartz over the years, Adler walked him through the bilirubin findings step by step. Schwartz later described the moment with the kind of simplicity that only comes when something very complicated finally resolves completely. He said, there it was, a simple, straightforward answer from the expert. He then reached for Sherlock Holmes, the way he often did when logic needed to carry the weight that emotion could not. If you eliminate all the possibilities, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, is most likely the truth. He had spent 17 years looking for a reason to stay skeptical. Adler had just taken the last one away. While the blood chemistry was extraordinary, there was something else that left researchers genuinely unable to move forward. The image that science cannot explain. The image on the shroud is not painted. The STURP team confirmed that across every centimeter of the cloth surface, after 3 years of peer-reviewed analysis, it is not a scorch from a heated statue because thermal burns produce a very specific fluorescence pattern under ultraviolet light, and the body image produces none of that. It is not a photograph because no photographic process that has ever existed encodes three-dimensional spatial data into a flat surface. And it is not a rubbing, a transfer, or any kind of contact impression, because the physics and chemistry of those methods make them completely incompatible with what the cloth actually shows. What the image actually is, examined at the atomic level, is a chemical change in the outermost layer of the linen fibers themselves, not a coating applied on top, not a pigment bonded to the surface. The fibers themselves have been altered. The colored region is approximately 200 nanometers deep, which is roughly 1/1700th of the total thickness of the cloth. To give that number some physical meaning, it is thinner than a single bacterium. The color exists only on the absolute topmost layer of each individual fiber, and does not penetrate even a fraction further. In places where two threads cross each other, the thread sitting underneath shows no coloration at the contact point whatsoever, as if whatever mechanism created this image was physically incapable of passing through even a single fiber to reach the one below it. The image also operates according to a principle that no medieval artist would have had any reason to understand or replicate. Each individual fiber is either colored or it is not. There is no gradation, no blending, no variation within any single fiber. The tonal variation that creates the recognizable image of a human face and body comes entirely from the number of colored fibers packed into a given area, which is precisely the same principle that printing dots use to create a photograph inside a newspaper. It is a binary halftone system encoded in ancient linen, and nobody has been able to explain how it got there. In 1976, 2 years before the STURP examination even took place, Air Force physicists John Jackson and Eric Jumper fed a photograph of the Shroud into a machine called a VP-8 image analyzer. This device had been built specifically for mapping the surfaces of other planets from satellite data. It works by converting image brightness into vertical relief, essentially turning a flat picture into a three-dimensional terrain map. When researchers tested it on normal photographs, paintings, and medical X-rays, it produced meaningless, distorted blobs with no spatial coherence. When they fed it the Shroud, it produced a geometrically accurate, fully rotatable, three-dimensional model of a human body with image intensity at every single point, corresponding precisely to the calculated distance between the body surface and the cloth. The engineer who had actually built the VP-8, a man named Peter Schumacher, had never heard of the Shroud before that day and had no religious background or stake in the outcome. His own written account of the experience states clearly, "Only the Shroud of Turin has produced these results." From 2005 through 2012, physicist Paolo Di Lazzaro and his team at Italy's ENEA National Research Center spent 7 continuous years attempting to replicate the image characteristics using an excimer laser operating at 193 nanometers wavelength in a deep vacuum environment. They achieved a genuine superficial coloration on small linen patches that closely matched the Shroud's 200 nanometer depth and binary fiber structure. It was the closest anyone had ever come. But when they calculated the energy required to reproduce the full body image across the entire cloth surface in a single event, the number they arrived at was 34 trillion watts, sustained for less than a billionth of a second. That is roughly equivalent to 3,400 simultaneous lightning bolts focused onto a single piece of fabric with surgical precision. No technology that exists anywhere on Earth today can produce that pulse. Di Lazzaro stated publicly that their research proved it was, in his own words, almost impossible to replicate all the main characteristics of the body image using any technology available in the Middle Ages or earlier, or indeed later. British filmmaker David Rolfe, whose 1978 documentary on the Shroud won a BAFTA award, announced a $1 million prize on Easter Sunday of 2022. The challenge was open to any person or institution willing to reproduce the Shroud image using only methods available in the medieval period, meeting all the known physical and chemical characteristics simultaneously. After more than 2 years with the challenge open and publicized internationally, not a single person applied. The challenge closed unclaimed, and the image remained exactly what STURP had declared it in 1981. The test that was supposed to end it. In April of 1988, a strip of linen approximately 10 millimeters wide and 70 millimeters long was cut from the bottom left corner of the Shroud and divided among 3 laboratories: the University of Arizona, Oxford University, and ETH Zurich. Radiocarbon dating technology had advanced to the point where the result, they said, would be definitive. On the 13th of October 1988, Oxford professor Edward Hall stood before a blackboard he had scrawled with the words 1,260 to 1,390, followed by an exclamation mark. He told reporters that someone had simply gotten a bit of linen, faked it, and flogged it. He compared believers in the Shroud to flat earthers. The result was published in Nature magazine, the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. Headlines everywhere declared the case closed. Shortly after the announcement, 45 wealthy donors contributed £1 million to endow a new chair at Oxford, the Edward Hall Chair of Archaeological Sciences. The first person appointed to that position was Dr. Michael Tite, the British Museum official who had supervised the carbon dating test itself. The man who oversaw the protocol and handled the samples was rewarded with an endowed academic chair funded by the same people who celebrated the result. Raymond Rogers saw nothing suspicious in the claims at first. A Los Alamos chemist, founding editor of a major peer-reviewed journal, and chemical research director of the original STURP team, he had strong credibility. When two researchers published a paper in 2000 suggesting the carbon sample came from a medieval repair patch, Rogers dismissed the idea as ridiculous. Determined to challenge it, he began his own investigation, aiming to disprove their theory using his expertise and direct analysis. Then he looked at the actual threads. What he found was that the sample corner contained cotton fibers of a Near Eastern variety woven into the linen. Those cotton fibers were completely absent from every other part of the shroud. The corner threads were coated with a yellow-brown plant gum containing madder root dye bonded with gum arabic, materials found nowhere else on the cloth. Medieval nuns who repaired the shroud after a catastrophic fire in 1532 had apparently done something more sophisticated than patching. They had expertly woven new cotton threads into the original linen and dyed them to match the aged fabric so precisely that the repair was invisible to the naked eye. The three most prestigious radiocarbon laboratories in the world had dated the repair, not the shroud. Rogers published his findings in Thermochimica Acta in January of 2005. His vanillin analysis showed the main shroud cloth had 0 vanillin remaining, matching the chemistry of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The repaired corner still had measurable vanillin. His kinetic calculations placed the age of the original cloth between 1,300 and 3,000 years old. He died on the 8th of March, 2005, 7 weeks after publication. In 2017, French researcher Tristan Casabianca used British Freedom of Information law to obtain 711 pages of raw data that the laboratories had kept unpublished for 30 years. His analysis, published in Archaeometry in 2019 by Oxford University Press, revealed that Arizona had performed 40 individual measurements, but only published 4. The overall statistical agreement index across all the raw data was 18.1%. The threshold for a valid test is 60%. Casabianca stated publicly, "The tested samples are obviously heterogeneous from many different dates. It is therefore impossible to conclude that the shroud dates from the Middle Ages." Now, this all brings us to the most important question: what a molecule does to a man. By the time Alan Adler explained bilirubin to Barry Schwartz in mid-1995, there were already a dozen converging lines of evidence that Schwartz had been cataloging for years. He knew about forensic anatomy. French surgeon Pierre Barbet had proven in the 1930s through cadaver experiments that nails through the center of the palm would tear through tissue and could not support body weight. Crucifixion required nailing through a specific gap between the wrist bones. Every time Barbet nailed through that gap, the median nerve was severed and the thumb snapped violently inward against the palm, locking there permanently in rigor mortis. The shroud shows 4 fingers on each hand. Both thumbs are invisible, tucked into the palms. Not one medieval painting of the crucifixion gets this detail right. The shroud gets it exactly right. He knew about the sudarium of Oviedo, a smaller cloth kept in a cathedral in northern Spain, with documented history stretching back to 570 CE. It carries no image, only blood and pleural fluid stains. When researchers overlaid it against the shroud face using polarized image technology, they found 70 points of coincidence on the front and 50 on the back. Both clothes carry the blood type AB. The calculated nose length from the fluid pattern on the sudarium is 8 centimeters, identical to the shroud image. The 2 cloths have never been in the same room. They have completely separate chains of custody stretching across more than 1,000 years. On the 14th of March, 1075, the chest containing the sudarium was officially opened in a ceremony witnessed by King Alfonso VI of Spain and Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, the man history records as El Cid. That is not a legend. That is a documented historical event with named witnesses. He knew about the pollen. Botanist Avinoam Danan of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem identified pollen from approximately 20 species growing in Jerusalem itself on the Shroud surface. The single most abundant pollen type was Gundelia tournefortii, a thorny thistle that blooms near Jerusalem from February through May, a species concentrated near the head of the image. It only exists in Israel and its neighboring regions. Its blooming season aligns precisely with Passover. He knew about the DNA. A 2015 genomic study published in Nature Scientific Reports identified mitochondrial DNA from haplogroup H33, a lineage found almost exclusively among the Druze, an ethno-religious community in the mountains of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. The DNA also showed traces from East Africa, India, and East Asia, suggesting the cloth had been handled by people from across the known ancient world, exactly consistent with a journey from Jerusalem through Edessa to Constantinople along the Silk Road. He knew about the textile. Swiss conservator Mechtild Fleury Lemberg, after 30 years as head of the Abegg Foundation Textile Institute, identified a stitching technique in the Shroud seam that she had encountered only once before in 4 decades of working with historic fabrics. That one other time was on textiles recovered from Masada, the Jewish fortress destroyed by the Romans in 73 CE and never reoccupied. All of this evidence existed before the Bilirubin phone call, but 17 years of scientific doubt had kept Schwartz at a careful distance from any firm conclusion. The blood was the wrong color, and he could not explain it. That was his wall. Adler's explanation did not just answer the question. It collapsed the wall entirely. Because bilirubin does not just explain the color, it tells you something about the level of suffering the person endured before the blood left their body. Bilirubin floods the bloodstream in response to extreme, prolonged physical trauma. The blood on that cloth was permanently red, not because of forgery, not because of pigment, but because the person it came from had been tortured so severely that their own liver chemistry had recorded the violence in a way that would outlast 2,000 years. Schwartz said it simply and directly. I now believe this cloth could only be the authentic burial shroud of the historic Jesus. He never converted and remained Jewish throughout his life. On January 21, 1996, he launched Shroud.com, a site he noted was 5 years older than Google. It grew to attract over 15 million visitors from more than 160 countries without ever displaying advertisements. He became a sought-after speaker, sharing his knowledge at seminaries, universities, Catholic conferences, and secular science forums. His lectures reached diverse audiences, from the Pontifical Athenaeum in Rome to the Vancouver Public Library, reflecting his commitment to open discussion and exploration across both religious and scientific communities worldwide. In April 2013, he delivered a TEDx talk at a venue on the Via della Conciliazione in Rome, the road leading directly to St. Peter's Square. He was a Jewish man standing at the threshold of the Vatican, telling a room full of people that the most important relic in their faith was authentic. He closed by saying, "I was in that room for you." He died on the 21st of June, 2024, at age 77, surrounded by his family. The conference dedicated to his memory in St. Louis just weeks after his death featured new papers on blood formation, DNA analysis, and AI-assisted image studies, all pointing toward the same conclusion that one phone call about a single molecule had forced him to accept nearly 30 years earlier. The image still cannot be replicated, and the $1 million prize remains unclaimed. Carbon dating has been questioned by its own raw data, while the blood remains red and the cloth itself unexplained. Despite decades of study, no clear answers have emerged. The man who spent 46 years following the evidence, who had every reason to walk away and no reason to stay, remained steady in his pursuit.
I even said, we'll get to Turin, we'll give us 5 minutes, we'll find the paint, we'll come home, we'll be done. Yeah, it's 44 years later. And there was no paint, and it's not a painting or an artwork, and I'm still involved. That image property hooked me. I realized that that was really something special.
He never wavered in his commitment to the facts and never converted, choosing to let the evidence speak for itself. If any part of this changed the way you think about what settled science actually means, Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one.